G'day guys and welcome to this business management lesson. In today's lesson we're looking at key knowledge point 327. That is unit 3, area of study 2 and the 7th key knowledge point in this area of study. Today specifically we're talking about termination management, and there are examples of different types of termination named in this key knowledge point that we'll discuss in this lesson. Termination management describes the situation where a business or an employee decides that it's time for that employee to leave their employment in that business. It's really, really important, and the government certainly identifies it as being important because there's a whole host of legislation around this area. It's really important that termination is managed fairly and equally and with sensitivity. And certainly in many cases, the business needs to maintain a great deal of confidentiality around the conditions under which someone leaves a business, because it's not always up to the employee. Termination can be voluntary, where an employee will put their hand up and say, I'm done, I don't want to work here anymore. Perhaps they're finished working altogether and they're going to retire. Or termination can be involuntary. And when someone's getting the sack, when someone's having their employment involuntarily terminated, there are a host of issues in that context. Retirement's one of the easy ones. Retirement describes when an employee has decided that they're finished working for a business and finished working altogether, that they do not see themselves returning to employment for the rest of their life. It's important that a business considers the impact that this will have on the retiree as they make this significant life transition, and certainly the business needs to consider what this means for the business as well. A retiree is entitled to gain access to the 9.5% minimum superannuation accrued during their time of work, and any workplace where they've worked throughout their career will have contributed to that minimum accrual of superannuation. And certainly any accrued entitlements like annual leave or long service leave that they haven't taken, they're entitled to have paid out at the end of their employment. Certainly for the individual, this is a significant step. They're going to move from having a reason to get out of bed every day and having a regular income to neither of those things. So businesses can often demonstrate corporate social responsibility by providing access to counseling or investment advice services to help the retiree manage their funds and implement a plan to ensure that they have a very comfortable retirement. And certainly lifestyle counseling can factor into that. Helping people find areas of passion and hobbies, things that they can dedicate their time and energy to in retirement so they don't fall to the all too common experience of leaving the workforce and then largely finding themselves feeling useless and unmotivated. For the business, they're about to lose one of their employees who would arguably have the most experience. This can leave a vacuum, and certainly if the business isn't focused on intentional succession planning, then when someone like this highly skilled employee leaves the business, there's going to be a gap within the workforce of skilled labor. Succession planning describes efforts made by a business to ensure that should one person leave employment, there's another person to fill their place. In employment where individualized skills aren't particularly important, or the skills can be taught quite quickly, this is less important. But certainly if you're losing someone from a higher level management position, unless you've been implementing training and providing development opportunities for your mid-level management staff, you might find that an executive manager steps out and your only option is to try and recruit an executive level manager from another business because there's no one within your own business to fill that position. So the loss of skills, the loss of experience for the business can be quite significant, and that's one transition issue the business needs to consider. In the event of resignation, much like retirement, it's voluntary. The employee decides that their time employed by this business is over. The key difference is they're not They're not expressing that they have no intention to return to the workforce at all. They're just ending their employment with the specific business that we're talking about. It might be because they've got access to a better career advancement opportunity. Better is a highly subjective word, but they have access to a career advancement opportunity in another business. They might see that the conditions or pay offered elsewhere are more attractive. Certainly, in many cases, they might just be sick of the industry they're working in and be looking for a change. Or even simpler still, they might just not like their job very much. It's important for any business to conduct an exit interview with that employee when the employee decides to leave. If it turns out the employee is leaving because they find their boss impossible to work for, or they're bored, or they find that conditions elsewhere are more attractive, it's important that the business they're leaving can get that information. Certainly, exit interviews are very valuable because an employee who's leaving the business will no longer feel obliged to paint a rosy picture of their workplace, and they might deliver some truths that they wouldn't have told you otherwise. And certainly, if there are problems in your business, you're going to want to implement corrective action to, excuse me, to fix these things. If your managers are exclusively autocratic and the employees feel suppressed and they don't have an opportunity to voice their own opinions and they feel undervalued, it's important that you can identify that. If you're offering conditions that you think are fair, but your employees are leaving because they determine that there are more attractive conditions within your competitors' businesses, that's something you want to know about. Definitely, because all of those things are going to have an impact on your ongoing ability to achieve your business objectives. Entitlements, much like with the retired employee, the employee is entitled to be paid out for any accrued benefits and completed work that they've achieved. And the business is entitled to receive notice from the resigning employee. In many industries, there is a minimum period of notice required, as determined by an industry award, that will describe how much notice an employee is required to give before they can terminate their contract. And once again, succession planning is important. While we're not always talking about very highly skilled and experienced employees when we're talking about resignation, just the fact that you're going to lose laborers, employees who you've invested in their training means that you're going to want to ensure that you're not going to be left shorthanded when this person steps out of the business. Now, redundancy is where things start to get a little bit more complicated. A situation in which a redundancy can occur is one in which a manager of a business looks at the roles that their employees play and determines that there is no longer enough work to justify all of the jobs. So you might have 20 staff to manage 40 customer accounts, and then for whatever reason, you lose a couple of customer accounts and you no longer need 20 staff. Perhaps you only need 18. Because you only need 18, you can make 2 staff redundant to save on costs. Remember that salaries are one of the most significant costs for a business manager. And in the event of redundancy, you're making cost savings by being able to legally terminate the employment of those employees quite simply because there's not enough work for them to do. Now, redundancy can be voluntary. You can implement a process as a business manager where you gather your employees and say, guys, this is the situation. There's not enough work for all of you. We need to make some redundancies. And if employees volunteer for redundancies, that is voluntary redundancy. That's as simple as it is. You might have had an employee who was thinking about a career change anyway, or an employee who's coming up to retirement age and they don't really see a problem with bumping that decision up by a couple of years. If you're not prepared to go down that route and offer voluntary redundancies, or certainly if you offer it and no employees take up the voluntary redundancies, you're still in the same situation you were. You still need to make redundancies, and that's when we move to involuntary redundancies. In the situation of an involuntary redundancy, you might give a worker a tap on the shoulder and ask them to join you for a quiet conversation where you explain to them that their position will not be continuing. And it can be a very difficult conversation to have indeed. Certainly, nobody likes losing their sense of job security. Certainly, nobody likes losing their sense of job security and their employment based on no fault of their own. It's a particularly unpleasant thing to subject an employee to, but it is just a fact of life, and it is the nature of business, unfortunately. Entitlements, as with any form of termination, your employees are entitled to be paid for the work they've done and any accrued entitlements that they haven't taken benefit of already. In addition to that, in the event of redundancy, employees are entitled to a redundancy package, which varies from industry to industry, but typically includes a notice period. So the employee will be told that in 8 weeks, your employment will be ended. Typically, redundancy packages also include a set payment of a period of weeks worth of salary. So at the end of the contract, as a sort of a termination bonus as part of redundancy, an employee might be paid for just a lump sum of 12 weeks of wages or 16 weeks of wages, depending on how long they've been in the business, and it varies from industry to industry. And certainly some businesses will offer the employee time off during that notice period to go and attend interviews and to try and seek employment elsewhere. Certainly, if in the case of an involuntary redundancy, if you are the business manager and you've just made the decision to end this person's employment, then you might understand how difficult and frightening that could be, and it would certainly be in your best interests to demonstrate corporate social responsibility and facilitate any efforts you can to assist this employee to gain further employment. Because redundancy can be such a shock to people, many businesses offer counselling in the event that redundancies are going to occur or do occur. Certainly for the employees who have been on the chopping block and then haven't been made redundant, that kind of disruption to their sense of job security can be demotivating. And so counselling to assist employees to sort of come back to that point of engagement and motivation is not a bad idea. And for the employees who are made redundant, outplacement services, businesses that work to try and hook up employees with certain skills and experience with job opportunities in other businesses might be made available. Certainly career advice, extra training, and financial advice are all things that employee is going to benefit from should the business offer it. Now, dismissal is when a business sacks someone. We're not talking about redundancy. We're not saying there was no work to do, so there was a process. It is when either an employee is failing to meet a predetermined standard and has continually failed to meet that predetermined standard, or the employee has committed a serious breach of their employment contract. In most employment contracts, in almost any job in any industry, if you do something significant that is illegal and would bring ill repute upon the business reserves the right to terminate your employment at that time. That would be a summary dismissal. If you saw on the news that a fast food worker abused a customer and it was filmed and it was on Current Affair, you better believe that that fast food worker no longer works there. They will have had their contract subject to summary dismissal. An on-notice dismissal is the alternative. When an employee has failed to meet a predetermined standard and has been given opportunities to improve, corrective action has been taken, and the employees continue to not meet a predetermined standard, then the employee can be given notice, given warnings, and after a certain number of warnings, once again, depending on the industry and the employee contract, the employee might be subject to on-notice dismissal. Entitlements for employees in these cases. Well, the first and most important entitlement is that dismissal is a complicated business. And if your human resources manager is not well versed in termination legislation, then it's very easy for them to do the wrong thing. And in the event of unfair dismissal, the business will face consequences. So, one entitlement for the employee is that the process is fair and transparent for the employee. There can't be any question that the reason the employee is being dismissed is above board. Certainly, you have to pay your employees for the work they did. So if you find out they've been stealing from the business, and they've been stealing for ages, and in fact they've cost you heaps of money, but you only find that out the day before payday, and they've been working for the past however long it's been since the last payday, you still have to pay them. You can't just withhold salary because you feel like it's the right thing to do. You have to pay your employees for the work they've done. Certainly, transition issues for dismissal are all largely around sensitivity and confidentiality, because in either case, on notice dismissal or summary dismissal, there's a real chance of having a strong negative impact on someone's reputation if the details of their dismissal just got out. Now, unfair dismissal occurs whenever an employee is dismissed from a business and the reasons aren't necessarily above board. There are legislated reasons that you can get rid of people. There are also significantly more legislated reasons you're not allowed to dismiss someone. So, you might dismiss an employee because they've missed a lot of work and you've offered them opportunities, you've tried to facilitate a carpool system to help them get to work, and you might dismiss them. But it turns out that they've been missing work because they are injured and they have medical certificates to prove that, and perhaps they tried to show you the medical certificates and you weren't interested, you were just cross because they kept showing up late or they kept missing work. If you dismissed them under those circumstances, that would be an unfair dismissal. And the consequences for the business for conducting unfair dismissal can be significant, ranging from just being forced to reinstate that person's employment, which quite frankly doesn't happen very often. If you've gone through the process of being sacked for a reason that was unfair, you're rarely interested in going back to that workplace. It's quite clear that the management weren't listening to you in the first place and weren't open to hearing your needs or whatever problems you were facing. So rarely is the employment reinstated, but typically financial compensation is required, and the business may be subject to fines and financial sanctions as a consequence. If unfair dismissal is seen to be as a result of discrimination or part of a picture of bullying and harassment, then the manager who's responsible can even face individual charges of bullying and harassment, which might attract personal financial sanctions and possibly even jail time if it's gone far enough. So it's really important that your HR managers know their legal requirements and manage termination to be above board, because if they don't, the consequences can be dire for the business and the impacts can be devastating for the employee. In summary for this key knowledge point, termination is when you end an employee's contract or when the employee ends the employee's contract. During termination, it's really important that the process is fair, it's lawful, it's all above board. Where termination is used as a form of sanction, it might be an effective motivator. Certainly, if there are a group of employees not meeting a standard and you can use on-notice dismissal to draw a line in the sand and say, all right, you're not meeting the standard, you're out, you might see a lift in the performance from the remaining employees. But all forms of termination are going to cost a business in one way or another, even if it's just in the costs associated with hiring a new employee to fill that position. And it's really important that you, as the business manager, are prepared for these costs. That's all for today. See you next time.